Welcome everyone to ME121, Human Anatomy and Physiology. My name is Angie Bland and I will be your instructor for our session. And just welcome. It's one of my favorite classes. So I'm hoping to light a spark in you to love knowing and understanding all the ins and outs of the human body because it is truly amazing. One side note, if you are taking ME105 at the same time as ME121, they do go hand in hand in terms of much of our content when we're focusing on a certain body system will be covered in both classes at the same time. Makes studying a whole lot easier. So hopefully that will be of help to you all. Let's go ahead and dive right in. I always like to start by telling you a little bit about the class itself, and we'll get to that in the presentation. So this week's presentation will be a little bit longer than our normal. And also I'd like to preface, my presentations don't cover all of the content in the chapter readings. It's going to cover the most important highlights and the most important content that's going to help prepare you for your quiz. So definitely while you're listening, take notes. You can stop the recording, you can reverse, you can fast forward, whatever you need to do, but it's helpful to write while you're watching it. Definitely, if you haven't already done so, you will want to order your textbook immediately. So that's one have to for week 1 for sure. Let's dive right in. This week we are going to focus on 2 chapters of study. Chapter 1, which is an introduction to anatomy and physiology, as well as Chapter 2, which hones in on cells and tissues. Now, I know when I was a student, cells and tissues were not my favorite thing, but hopefully we'll make it as pain-free as possible for you all. So let's talk about some ins and outs and some terminology that's just great information, as well as information that your quiz is going to want you to know also. So science, when we hear that term, it is a way of thinking and it is a method of investigating the world in a systemic manner. So it's important to know that science is systematic in the way we go about things. Anatomy and physiology, obviously that's what our class is focusing on, but what the heck does that mean? Well, anatomy deals with the structures or the morphology of the body and its parts. In other words, it's the names of everything in our body. Physiology studies the functions of the parts, and it asks the questions, how do they work? These two do go hand in hand. They're interrelated because the functional role of the parts depend on how it's constructed. Our body is such a fine-tuned machine. Things are shaped in a certain way to help aid in their function, which is why when we study them together. Directional terms are important to know. It makes the world of medicine a whole lot easier if we are all speaking the same language and we can picture things in our head the same way when we use a term. So anatomical position is what we're seeing our lady on the left in. And that means our body's erect, our face is forward, our upper limbs are at our sides with our palms forward. It's important to know that. In relative terms, the following up here describe the location of one body part with respect to another. So you will notice I've grouped them in pairs because they're opposites. So superior means above another part. Inferior means below a part. Another word for inferior that I want you to know is caudal. C-A-U-D-A-L. And you will see it down a couple bullet points below. Cephalad means the same thing as superior, and caudal means the same thing as inferior. Anterior versus posterior. Anterior is towards the front of our body. Posterior is towards the back. Median versus lateral. Median or medial both mean the same thing. Towards the midline. Lateral means towards the outside or towards the side. If we have structures that are paired, that means bilateral, means a structure on each side. And then we can get into some other terms, ipsilateral, contralateral. I won't focus on those today. But the last pair that you see up here is proximal versus distal. So proximal means closer to the point of attachment or another reference point on the body. And distal means further from the point of attachment or another reference point on the body. Our body can also be described in different planes. And when you think of planes, think of it as individually slicing the body one way or another. So if we were going to individually slice in one of these directions, as that's color-coded by the planes of the body, it would mean how we could describe the body one side versus the other, or one half versus the other. So the sagittal plane divides the body into right and left portions. If it passes along the midline, the exact middle of the body, that is known as mid-sagittal. And mid-sagittal would divide us into equal right and left portions. Transverse, also referred to as horizontal, that's where we divide the body into an upper portion and a lower portion, or a superior portion and an inferior portion. Frontal is the same as coronal. That divides the body into anterior, which is the front of the body, versus posterior, which is the back of the body. And that you can see in the orange plane in our picture. The body consists of right and left halves that are mirror images. That means our body has bilateral symmetry. And that is a term to know for your quiz as well. We can also describe our body in terms of its cavities. So the body can be divided into an axial portion, which is basically our head, neck, and trunk, and an appendicular portion, which is our upper and lower limbs. The axial portion contains several cavities that house body organs. The cranial cavity houses the brain. The vertebral cavity, also known as the spinal cavity, that houses the spinal cord. There is one segment of the vertebral cavity that I want you to be familiar with, and that's the lumbar region. The segment of the lower back and the side between the lowest rib and the pelvis, that's known as your lumbar region. The thoracic cavity houses the heart, lungs, and mediastinum. The abdominopelvic cavity, that is actually two cavities kind of smushed together. The abdominal cavity, and that's the viscera of digestion as well as the spleen. And the pelvic cavity, that's the end of the large intestines, the urinary bladder, and the reproductive organs. There is a separation between the thoracic and the abdominal cavities, and that's the diaphragm. If we were going to look at the thoracic and abdominopelvic cavities together, that's known as our ventral cavity, and our cranial and our spinal cavities together are known as our dorsal cavity. One other important note to remember is there's two structures that characterize humans as vertebrates. And they are the cranium, which is also known as the brain case, and the backbone, which is known as our vertebral column. So that's important to remember. Looking more specifically at our thoracic and abdominopelvic membranes, there's a double-layered membrane in that lines this area. The parietal portion actually attaches to the wall, and the visceral portion covers the internal organs. The thoracic cavity is lined with pleural membranes. The parietal pleura lines the cavities, while the visceral pleura covers the lungs. There's fluid between those two layers. The heart is surrounded by a pericardial membrane, which is found in the pericardial cavity. The parietal pericardium makes up the outer sac of the heart, and the visceral pericardium covers the heart itself. There is a serous fluid that separates the two layers. The peritoneal membranes line the abdominopelvic cavity. The parietal peritoneum lines the wall, and the visceral peritoneum covers the organs itself. Another term I want you to be familiar with, and there was really no good place to throw it in, so I'm kind of throwing it in on you here. And you can see the ribs are indicated on our picture here. There's a medical term that means rib, and it's costal. C-O-S-T-A-L. That is important to remember. breaking us down into our parts. Sometimes it's hard to remember that we are basically a collection of atoms. So the human body is a sum of its parts, and the parts can be studied at various levels of organization. So chemically, the atoms are the simplest level. 2 or more atoms comprise a molecule. Atoms and molecules associate in specific ways to form cells, which is the highest level of organization. Organelles, that's a term to know, are specialized cell structures that are used to carry out a specific function in the cell. Talking next about inorganic versus organic compounds. This has a lot of words on it, and I apologize, but it's hard for you to remember all of this just by hearing me say it. So I wanted the slide to be all inclusive into a lot of information. So bear with me because there's nothing visually appealing about this slide. Inorganic compounds are relatively small, simple chemical compounds such as water, salts, simple acids, and bases. Organic compounds, these are our large, more complex compounds containing carbon. Ions are electronically charged atoms or groups of atoms. There are 4 important groups of organic compounds that I want you to know. Carbohydrates. And carbohydrates, these are our sugars and starches that are used by the body as fuel molecules, so they store energy. Lipids. Proteins. Proteins are complex organic compounds composed of chemically linked amino acid subunits. And nucleic acids. One nucleic acid in particular is RNA, and it's a nucleic acid that functions mainly in the expression of the cell's genetic information for the manufacturing of proteins. So all of that information discussed on this slide and that I told you verbally is going to be important for your quiz. At times, it's hard to understand why we have to talk about the cellular level, but truly it's all related. This is what makes us up. Cells are the basic unit of structure and function for living things. They combine. Tissues are just basically groups of cells that function in the same way. And then groups of tissues form organs that have specialized functions. Groups of organs that function together are known as organ systems. And organ systems functioning together make up an organism. So you can see how we go from the simplest atom into what we are all comprised of. This shows all of our organ systems. And the fundamental characteristics of life are shared by all organisms and are represented here. So movement, responsiveness, growth, reproduction, respiration, digestion, absorption, circulation, assimilation, and excretion. These 10 characteristics constitute metabolism. Metabolism just means all physical processes that take place in the body. Looking more specifically at metabolism, again, that's all the processes that take place in the body, we can break it down a little further. So, anabolism, this is the energy is used to make chemical compounds and structures needed by the cell. This is the building and synthetic phase of metabolism. So anabolism and catabolism are parts of metabolism. Catabolism, this is the breakdown phase. So they're opposites. Anabolism is the buildup, catabolism is the breakdown. It provides the energy required for anabolism. And again, anabolism is the building phase. Cellular respiration, this is a catabolytic process in which nutrients are broken down. As the energy is stored in these nutrients are released. It is packaged within energy storage compounds called ATP. You do not need to know what ATP stands for, but it is listed on there. But you do need to know what ATP is. Homeostasis. Homeostasis is like our thermostat. It's an internal control. So homeostasis is just the maintenance of a stable internal environment, just like our thermostat at home maintains a stable temperature. Stress can activate homeostatic mechanisms that return the body to its steady state. Homeostatic mechanisms are self-regulating control systems that maintain an appropriate internal body environment. In a positive feedback system, a change in the condition that varies from the state sets off events that intensify the change. In Chapter 2, they focus more on cells again, so we're going to go through some more specifics as to organelles. So many organelles are surrounded by membranes that form compartments, and the compartments allow the cell to separate various processes. Most cells are bounded by a thin plasma membrane that protects the cell and regulates the passage of materials into and out of the cell. The plasma membrane consists of a double layer of lipids in which proteins are embedded. The nucleus, that's the control center of the cell. It contains chromosomes, which contain genes. Genes are units of hereditary information, and the genes are composed of DNA. The nucleus also houses the nucleolus, and that's the site for ribosome assembly. Mitochondria, those are the power plants of the cell. They are the sites of the most of the reactions of cellular respiration, which is a process that captures energy for the cell. During cellular respiration, some of the energy is stored as ATP, which we talked about earlier. Rough endoplasmic reticulum has a granular appearance that results from the presence of organelles called ribosomes. A small membrane enclosed structure that holds or transports some type of cargo within the cell is known as a vesicle. Some other odds and ends that are important to know. Goblet cells. I want you to remember that term, goblet cells. It's in the lining of the intestines specifically, and it secretes mucus. And mucus is just a slippery protective substance that our intestines needs. The other odd and end I want you to remember that's on your quiz, in the upper right, the picture on the left, it shows a cell with a flagella, which is a tail. That's a sperm. And the sperm are tiny cells with long whip-like tails, and the tail is known as a flagella, so that's important to remember. So there's different ways materials can pass through cell membranes. Let's go through these. Diffusion. That's the movement of molecules or ions from one region to another because of their random molecular motion. The net movement of molecules in diffusion is from a region of greater concentration to a region of lower concentration. So it's really crowded up here. Let's go somewhere it's not so crowded. That's diffusion. Osmosis is a kind of diffusion in which molecules of water diffuse through a selectively permeable membrane. Active transport. This is where cells expend energy to transport materials across membranes from a region of lower to a region of higher concentration. So it's kind of like we're going against the norm, and that takes energy. If we were going to float in a river and go downstream, it would be very easy. But if we wanted to float in the river and go upstream, we would have to, take some effort and energy. That's active transport. Phagocytosis. These cells ingest large solid particles by engulfing them or enclosing them in a vacuole pinched off from the plasma membrane. So an example of this, white blood cells will attack bacteria. It actually ingests the bacteria by phagocytosis. Cells undergo various osmotic conditions. An isotonic solution has a solute concentration equal to that of cells. When cells are placed in an isotonic solution, there's no net movement of water molecules. Everyone's happy, we don't need to move. When cells are placed in a hypertonic solution, one with a higher solute concentration than that of the cells, the water molecules kind of freak out and they leave the cells, causing them to shrink. An example, when blood cells are placed in a hypertonic solution, there is a net movement of water molecules out of the cells. When cells are placed in a hypotonic solution, one with a lower solute concentration than that of the cells, water molecules move into the cells, causing them to swell. An example, when blood cells are placed in a hypotonic solution, there's a net movement of water molecules into the cells. Hyper, the water wants to leave. Hypo, the water wants to get in. If you kind of think of the water molecule movement in that way, it might help you remember it. The cell life cycle. Hopefully we all can recall our 7th grade math when we learned mitosis, because it's all coming about full circle here. So the life stages of a cell includes interphase, which is the growth and the activity between mitosis. A cell reproduces itself by undergoing mitosis and then divides to form 2 new cells. During prophase, again, that's the first phase of mitosis, the chromatin coils make the chromosomes visible. The nuclear membrane dissolves, the centrioles migrate towards the opposite ends of the cells, and the spindles in a spindle made of microtubes forms. Next comes metaphase. During metaphase, the chromosomes position along the equator of the cell. During anaphase, that's our 3rd step, sister chromatids separate and the 2 sets of chromosomes move towards the opposite ends of the cell. Next, we have telophase. This phase is when the chromosomes begin to uncoil and the nuclear membrane forms around each set of chromosomes and cellular division occurs. Mitosis ensures that the chromosomes are duplicated and distributed to each new cell. The last thing we need to talk about are types of tissue, and we're going to start with epithelial. The major function of epithelial tissue is protection. It covers the body and lines the body cavities. The main types of epithelial membranes are mucous membranes, serous membranes, and the skin. Mucous membrane lines the body cavities that open to the outside of the body. Next, we have connective tissue. Connective tissues bind, they support, they protect, they serve as the framework. They fill spaces, they store fat, they produce blood cells, they protect against infection, and they help repair tissue damage. Almost every organ in the body has a framework of connective tissue that supports it. Adipose tissue, which is an important one to know, stores fat and releases it when the body needs energy. Our last 2 tissue types are muscle tissue and nerve tissue. So muscle cells or fibers can contract and shorten to provide movement. They consist of 3 major types: skeletal, smooth, and cardiac. They generally do not divide, but they will grow larger. Nervous tissue is found in the brain, spinal cords, and the nerves. So just a couple of side notes, just in terms of our class structure. I'm big on you all knowing what's expected each week up front. That was the first thing as a student that I always went to the syllabus and I looked for, okay, what's due when. Each week you're generally going to have 3 things you need to focus on for our class: discussion, a quiz, and an assignment. There are some weeks where you might have something additional. We'll talk about that in upcoming. You can always, in the classroom, go to the modules section and it will show you what's due for each week. As well as in that area, there's also a From the Instructor document that you need to read each week because it's going to give my helpful hints and some reminders. Generally speaking, you should have your first discussion posting each week done by Wednesday. That gives your classmates time to read and respond to it. Throughout the week, you will be responsible for responding to 2 additional people. So you should have a minimum total of 3 postings each week. They do need to be substantive, more like paragraphs and not just sentences. Also due by Sunday is your quiz and assignment. Each week you will have a quiz and assignment. Make sure that you do turn them in on time. One of the worst things you can do is to fall behind. I see a lot of people make that mistake. Definitely make sure that you're planning accordingly and you're marking all your due dates. The only exception to this is week 10 is built a little bit different. Week 10 starts on a Thursday and ends on a Thursday. Otherwise, this is our structure for the class. And I will remind you of week 10 when we get closer to it. Some other friendly reminders. Definitely ask questions. Human anatomy and physiology, it's a lot to take in. So if you are confused, ask questions. If you don't know what's expected, ask questions. There's nothing that is off limits. You can email me at any time. Definitely do so if you are confused or need assistance. In the upper right of the dues box, time management is important, especially in online classes because we don't meet face-to-face at a certain time. I expect that throughout your week you're going to set time aside for our specific class and that you are going to manage your due dates as well to get your work in on time. Have fun. Class should be fun. This should be information that you want to learn because it's going to help you for your future career path. And if you ever don't see the connection on how this relates to what you're going to school for, then we need to talk about that because all of your classes should relate to what you are going to be doing for a living. And it shouldn't be boring or something you hate to do. This should be information that sparks your mind and your interest and gets you excited about your career. Set goals for yourself. Set your weekly goals in terms of when you're going to do what. Set goals for what grades you want to achieve. Set goals for information you want to read more up on. Just make sure that you set goals because without goals, the likelihood of you achieving something satisfactory out of the class goes down. So definitely set goals. The sponge is my favorite. You pay a lot of money to go to school and you have a great opportunity. This isn't a have to. You're choosing to come to school. Soak up all of the knowledge and the information and the experience that you possibly can. This should be your time to shine. So don't sit back and wait for it to hit you. Soak it in. Take advantage of everything you possibly can. There's one big don't, and it's that empty seat we see there on the right. I can't look at you in class and tell if you are participating or not because we are not in a room together. But I will know if you're not communicating. So don't be that empty seat. Make sure you're checking your email every day. Make sure you're logging into the classroom every day. Make sure that you're responding to emails when you get them. Make sure that you're checking in with me if you have questions. Don't be that empty seat. That's the worst thing you can do for yourself because then you're not taking advantage of this opportunity. Again, always ask questions. I don't want anyone to feel like that you're in this journey by yourself. You're never alone. I am in it with you, and I will always be your biggest fan and advocate, but I definitely need you to participate fully, and when you have questions, you have to speak up. As always, our information that we present or we talk about in our sessions and our presentations and in class, it's going to come from your textbook. The textbook for our class is Introduction to Human Anatomy and Physiology, 4th edition. Definitely make sure you order it as soon as possible. In the first couple of weeks, the chapters are available to you in the modules section of the classroom. That will not continue through the whole class. So you do need to order the textbook. But if you are still awaiting for your textbook to arrive, you should be able to complete everything you need each week with those chapters that are available to you while you're waiting on your textbook. Thank you so much for your time today, and here's to a great class session. Thank you.